Today I'm going to do an Arnold Schwarzenegger double bill from the 90s. These are both 90s films. Schwarzenegger, as people who are older will know, was a big icon from the early 80s to the mid 90s. Then he kind of fell away and he's never been quite as big as he used to be. Still a well known figure, but kind of like, as a Wacom Dino comparison, there was a peak period where he seemed interested in things, and then after that he seemed to have lost all interest and started phoning it in. You know, he's the De Niro of the blockbuster movies. Great peak, massive trough. This is a shame because it was a very enjoyable screen presence. I mean, he had a lot of limitations, but he worked them to his own advantage in lots of really interesting ways. But he had his time. At a certain point, certain actors like Keanu Reeves and Nicolas Cage and stuff took over a little bit from the action. Like they actually had actors rather than muscle men. So he had his peak period, and he has tried to come back. He went and became a governor for a while. Then after that, he came back and made other films. None of which were as big as before, but he was much better actor at this point in them. So that helped him a little bit. But there's only so much he can do. He's not a massive thespian or anything. He's a movie star. That's it. That's what he is. He's a movie star. He's iconography over acting. And if you get a director who can use that, you can get gangbusters. Or you can get a director who can understand that, plus can get the human side of him out as well. You have some interesting films. I mean, he started off Stay Hungry, supporting part of Jeff Bridges and Sally Fields and Bob Rafelson. That was a nice start. Then, of course, he was in Pumping Iron, the documentary, where he was basically the star of that. But it became a movie star because of Conan the Barbarian, directed by John Milius. Milius understood exactly who Schwarzenegger was, his limitations, his strengths. The idea is you give him certain lines. You give other actors more lines, but you give Arnold certain lines that he can say well, and that can make the impact. He's kind of like the Steve McQueen style, where terseness is really important. Like don't give him speeches. You know, don't do that. Just give him moments. Give him reactions. He got good at reactions. Speeches, less so. But reactions and looks and visualization, he was very good at. And as he went on, he became a more humane figure within movies. Of course, his big iconic figure was Terminator. The first one, he was all icon. Just this terrifying killing machine that was out to kill Sarah Connor. The sequel twisted his look a little bit to make him the Protector, and that worked really well too. It's not the films we're going to talk about, but those are films that are playing with his image in interesting ways. He did did the right films, Twins, Kindergarten Cop and Junior, all of which tweaked his image by making him a big softie in the kind of Frankenstein body, which worked really well because it played off what he was in interesting ways. And they're fun movies. They're not great movies, but they're fun movies. He did two killing films. He did Predator, which is one of those iconic 80s action movies, action sci-fi horror movies. It just works perfectly. It's just great. And he is up against, in this one he's up against something, an alien kill machine that's actually bigger than he is, which gives him a different dimension. He was also one of McTiernan's last action hero, which was a disaster, but a very interesting one, which I'll probably end up going towards and talking about in another video at some point. But what I'm going to look at today is his film with Paul Verhoeven and his other film with James Cameron. I've already covered Terminator series before, so you can go back and watch that video if you want. So I'm covering Total Recall and True Lies. So I'll cover the best one first, which is Total Recall. Total Recall is a blast. I mean, I think if I've got a favourite Schwarzenegger film, it's Total Recall. I mean, I'm a massive fan of Terminator, the first Terminator. I really like Terminator 2. I'm a massive fan of Predator. But Total Recall for me is his best one. That's the one I like most. Because one, you're Paul Verhoeven directing, and two, it's a paranoid fantasy where all of Arnold's limitations become a strength for the film, where his muscles don't matter. They help him get on a little bit, but they're part of the joke, but they don't matter ultimately what the plot's about. Basically, the idea is he's this henpecked guy who's having dreams of Mars. I mean, you've probably all seen the film. He's a henpecked guy, dreams of Mars. Is it a fantasy? Because it could be a fantasy we all have in our lives, where you basically are thinking about something a lot as you go through your life, and it's never going to come to anything. It's just a daydream. It's not anything that's ever going to be anything. You might think of an image or a person who you don't know who it is, but it's your imagination, so it's not really something solid. But he's obsessed with this idea of Mars, like something of Mars. He wants to go to Mars. He's in a marriage. He's moved to a new city, so he's trying to fit in. He's a construction worker, so hence big bulk. You know, he needs a bulk to do his job, but he's just an everyman. He's just a guy who's just pretty henpecked. He loves his wife loves him, but there are troubles because he wants to go to Mars and she doesn't. But the focus on this, the dreams he's having, the feelings he's having, makes him go to this place called Recall, which is a place that implants memories, fake memories, to make you think you've been somewhere. So if you've got an extra go somewhere but you can't afford it, this makes, instead of actually going and getting yourself utterly skint, this implants a memory to you, so you think you've been there, so you've actually had the experience, so you don't have to go, so you've actually clocked it up and you've done it, and you can move on with your life. Well, that's the theory. So a lot of people go into that, because you're messing around your mind, there's controversy about it, because people are saying people are having episodes and becoming psychotic. So Arnold ignores this, obviously, because he's obsessed. It's funny seeing Schwarzenegger play an obsessed character. He doesn't play obsessed very often, apart from these two movies that I'm talking about today. And he goes to Recall. He's still kind of mild-mannered, but he wants to go to Mars, so he's going to do it. He's going to get the implant. But also, during the time, they say to him, do you want to be a secret agent and do a mission on Mars? And so you always think later on you were more important than you actually were. So you feel you've done something amongst this crazy world. Because in this world, it feels like it's because Verhoeven's in charge of the film, it's a lot of politics. So you've got politics on Mars, the Northern Bloc and Southern Bloc. The Cohagen, who's the dictator of Mars, is actually imposing martial law on the people, and it suggests that even in on Earth, there's problems as well. People seem to be okay, but there seems to be the usual political problems, and different around the world. There's different problems that happen in life. So Recall's telling you, do you want to feel you're a secret agent? Kind of the way that movies make you feel that you're another person for 2 hours or something. So this is a film that's actually very postmodern about the film you're watching, because everyone kind of fantasises through a film like this person doing all these great things, and you can imagine him with them. That's the idea. Or you can just enjoy the absurdity or the entertainment value. Depends what kind of person you are, how distant you are from the image that's coming in. Because as we know, some people are much more into the image, into the stories, and other people are more distant from it. Just depends on your personality. So Schwarzenegger agreed to do the secret agent one. Then when he goes into you get the implant, he goes crazy and says, "You've blown my cover." So at this point, you don't know if this is the start of the mission or it's the start of the psychosis. Because either he has been, maybe from their point of view, what we're hearing is there really wasn't a memory implant on him already, and it's been blown because they try to put a recall in. But it could be him reacting to the actual recall implant. Because I don't think the idea originally was you start to go crazy in the recall office. And all his paranoid fantasies about his co-workers, about his wife, all this stuff, all this feelings, like things that could be just unease about the way people are not reacting to his fantasies about what he should be, suddenly become suspicious and paranoid and a grand conspiracy. So the film was always working on both levels because as you rewatch it, actually, one of the things was it always works on both levels. It's always an example of a genre film, but it's also a send up of a genre film. In a way that Last Action Hero tried to be, but failed because it didn't have the story for it. But this film, it actually had a story for it to support it, where basically you've got a guy who is experiencing the adventure when he feels he's just an everyman. But also, it's always setting it up slightly, saying, like, this is a bit convenient. This is all paranoid. This is all in your mind. This is all you fantasizing. So there's a great moment midway through the film, after he's been through adventures, he's been hunted down through Earth, now he's in Mars, which leads to this image, which I've got here, of how he gets into Mars under a disguise of a woman, and it takes up the thing malfunctions, and the head comes out and he's below the head. There's always this sense of reality falling apart. That's what Verhoeven brings to it. There's a lot of violence, but there's also a sense of this is like the subconscious of this guy's exploding into violence. It's like everything's been suppressed is coming out, and the violence and the rage of his life, how it particularly feels, is now coming out and exploding all over the place and destroying things he's seen around him. And the paranoia of it all comes out in the violence and the way Verhoeven moves the camera, so you never get a moment's peace. As soon as he goes to recall, everything's calm, and then as soon as he gets the implant, all hell breaks loose, and he's never secure for the rest of the film. The rest of the film he's always on the run. He gets like a moment's peace and screen time. It's always a sense of reality's crashing, always. So it could be just people trying to kill him, but it could be subconscious working on him and always never giving him rest as he goes through this adventure, as his brain's slowly going into meltdown. So it works on both levels, always. And we get to the middle section where he's going through all of these adventures. He's starting to discover that there is a conspiracy, that he has had his memory wiped. He's really a guy called Hauser, and he's trying to figure out why his memory was wiped and what's going on and what the situation is. And then a guy walks in the room and says, "You're not really standing here. You're actually in recall. You're having paranoid fantasies based on the implant. And all your subconscious has infected the programming. So you're now inventing from, you're inventing from the programming, but you've gone off on weird tangents. So we can tell you certain things that's going to happen." And he lists a couple of things. You'll become Hagen's bosom buddy and a blue sky on Mars and alien world fantasies. A lot of paranoid shit that all comes true, ultimately. And it makes it sound paranoid. He goes, "Really, are you suggesting there's a massive worldwide conspiracy to make you think you're a lowly construction worker, or are you having a breakdown?" which just really works wonderfully. So, the first half's especially good because there's never a sense of it not being a fantasy. There's always a sense of the alien and the weird and the alienated person always on the run, always trying to work out what's going on in his head. And there's a sense there's never really any solution. And it really plays around a lot with Schwarzenegger's persona because, yeah, he's a big guy, but no matter how much money muscles you've got, you're pretty vulnerable to the idea that maybe you're going mad. Muscles don't mean anything when it comes to that. And that makes it really work because if it's getting Schwarzenegger, it really twists you. Plus the idea is, he does look like an action hero, so the action hero side of it makes sense, but also the fantasy thing of he's just a henpecked guy also makes sense. A guy who's never realised the potential. I mean, the funny thing is, that, and they did a remake, a terrible remake with Colin Farrell as in the Quaid part, and it didn't work. Part because there was too much action, not enough story, but also the idea that Colin Farrell did not look like an action hero. So the action side failed, and the character side never was there any balance there. Plus, it's a really stupid film. But the film's wonderful because it keeps twisting. So all the twists in the second half of the movie all play around with the idea that you can't trust your own brain. Like you're setting yourself up, and the paranoia of who you are is always twisting yourself because you think that the hero, then it tells you you're actually the villain. And that could be your own mind playing against you, but it also could be a part of the program and you're infecting because they tell you from recall that this is going to happen. It does happen. And there's always alien fantasies, which sounds like a conspiracy theory thing that anybody who goes going mad will think of. The aliens will save us from our problems, which happens here, but it happens in an interesting way. But it also feels like it's a fantasy from like a video game or a paranoid movie. So it's got a wonderful duality to it always, and it's also a very convenient conclusion. And it's a bit over the top. It is like a big action hero solution to a complex problem because Verhoeven's always weaving in this idea about oppression, like the dictatorship of Mars. Like Huygens are sadist who has his foot down everybody. You see this in Mars is this society that's underground, under the mountains. They need to pay for air. Huygens like making them pay a lot of money. People are starving, and he doesn't care, like at all. And it's the whole thing about there's always going to be a dictatorship somewhere. There's always going to be someone who's evil and greedy, and they have all these human problems. And what's the solution? Oh, aliens will help us. Or ancient alien civilization will help us. It'll solve the problem by put air on Mars, which of course causes the problem for if it's an implant. It means that he's gone so far into the fantasy of his existence that there's no way to come back from that. Like, I think the idea of the recall was always like you're going to have a fantasy where you have an important mission, but when you come out, nothing's really changed. So when you come back to your life, nothing's changed. Nothing's ever really changed. Like, you can just think, oh yes, I had an interesting adventure, no one knows, no one will ever know. Instead, this fantasy goes mad where he's attacked by his own wife and attacked by his friends, so you can never trust them anyway. And he's turned Mars into a breathable planet, which means you can't really bring him back from that fantasy, like ever. So you have to lobotomize him because he's. So what should be a promise in a scenario, a spy scenario within an implant, has become a reality that we are desperate person may need that emotionally to feel like they've been justified. The same way as we all watch movies and look for some amazing ending that solves your lives for 20 minutes after you watch it to make you feel a lot better about yourself, but it doesn't mean anything because we leave the cinema to tell you problems. This is the most extreme version of that. You're the viewer plus you're the participant in this, and it goes how crazy it is if your mind goes mental. Like the stories you tell yourself and the fantasies you're feeding yourself are all based on empowerment to take away from your feeling of lack of power. Which is what Verhoeven's great at. Verhoeven's really good at satirising the fantasies we have to make ourselves able to live through dark times. He's great at that. He just shows you how dark we can be and how horrible we can be, but also the funny little tropes we've got in our head, the storytelling tropes we have in our head that are very unique. I mean, he did have a book about the life of Jesus, because he's interested in the life of Jesus before being a believer. And it's a really interesting book, and it's interesting how he looks at the way the Bible's constructed, where some stories seem to have moved around a little bit to have a better story, rather than if you look at the way a lot of stuff are described, logically it would happen in different order, but it's been switched around for storytelling purposes. And how the Bible's almost reality's been switched to a narrative that will help you get through your life. because that's religion. Religion does something similar to what to the recall thing has done. It's another story, it's an image to help you get through your life. The way stories do that to us, that's what we go to stories for. It's partly psychotic. You know, it really is. And if someone's susceptible to that and get too ingrained in that, and they can become a stalker or something like that, they can become mentally ill over imagery that they can't quite place. So that's how this film takes Schwarzenegger the icon, shows the schlub below it, keeps the icon but says you shouldn't trust the icon. And it does it in a way that no one else ever did with Schwarzenegger. It's a shame they never did any more films together. I mean, they were going to do Crusades, which is all about iconography and Christian iconography, and the Crusades, which would have been interesting with Schwarzenegger and Verhoeven. Didn't happen. But we have this, and we have Robocop, and we have Starship Troopers, three great Verhoeven satires on the way we view our lives in America. Yeah, Verhoeven in the American period was really awesome. Even his weak films were really good in a weird way. They were always interesting, apart from Hollow Man. Even that, for a cheap B movie that you didn't care about, even that's pretty good fun. Okay, now we're going to True Lies, the Schwarzenegger James Cameron film from the mid-90s. This was Schwarzenegger's big last film, really, ultimately. After this film, it was almost like a cut-off point where after this he wasn't good. This was the last one he seemed to really give a shit about. I mean, he did something like Eraser, which was okay, but it had a lot of problems. Then he did Batman and Robin, which was not a good career move. And then after that, he just seemed to wander into kind of mediocre films like End of Days and Terminator 3. You know, he just never seemed to have the same sparkling. His eyes were in politics at that point. So the films kind of suffered because it wasn't working with the directors he needed. Like, essentially, he needed to go to get back with Verhoeven, do something with Verhoeven after Verhoeven had done Starship Troopers, just do something there rather than work with these other mediocre directors and not really do much. So he had a while where he wasn't getting anywhere. So this was his last one. This was when he was still in power. This was like created when he was still a big power base after like Total Recall, Kindergarten Cop, and Terminator 2. They were all big hits. He was going from hit to hit to this point. Like there was no stopping him. And then Last Action Hero happened. But this was his follow-up to Last Action Hero. This is the film he made after that. So it was in production when Last Action Hero bombed. So no one knew that Last Action Hero was going to bomb as much as it did. But this film came out, did well. So it looked like he'd recovered from his wobble. But he actually hadn't. Because there was other problems. Like, time had moved on. And Schwarzenegger was very good at finding ways to reinvent himself in any culture. Like, he came through the Reaganite 80s, but in a sense of humour, and he wasn't, even though he was a Republican, he wasn't hard, he never felt really hardcore about anything, and he was always very playful with his image, and, you know, there was a sense of play with Schwarzenegger that people like Stallone didn't have, and he was always tweaking his image and always been fairly adventurous and trying new things, because he seemed to always know that don't get bogged down anywhere because people get bored with you. Probably because he knew that it's such a defined image that can only go so many ways, so he's always finding ways to be inventive with it. So the actual, he was getting better as he went along, but the stories he was working with around him were always changing so that he could always get in interesting projects. And he kind of lost that, and he'd ran out of things to do that he could put himself in, or he didn't find the next collaborator he needed to actually get to the next stage. Because True Lies is kind of a mess, but it's also a very enjoyable mess. It's one of those films that even you're watching it, you know, this is like half an hour too long, really, and there are bits that do not work, but it's kind of interesting. And it kind of goes on to the same idea about your fantasy of yourself and your reality, and a lot of stuff Total Recall played around with. But it's done by James Cameron, who wrote and directed this. This was his follow-up to Terminator 2, and it's probably his worst film. You know, I mean, you know the Piranha 2 thing, which no one knows how much directed or how much he didn't. His 80s, Cameron's 80s stuff is much better than this. Terminator 2 is much better than this. Even Titanic, which I have problems with, is much better than this because it knows what it is. Even though there's some cheesy dialogue, it knows what it is, and that's why it was a hit because it delivered what it was. And same with Avatar. Avatar knew what it was. You like it or you don't, but it delivered what it was. This one, I had feeling that he wasn't quite sure of his own base here. Like he was doing things that were very much in keeping with his style and was doing stuff that wasn't. I felt there was different story arcs that he was going back and forth to, and they weren't mingling right. So he a story arc that was a spy story, the personal story, and it was just a case he'd start one, then stop the other one for a bit, and then start that one, stop it, and it was very start stops the movie in a way that wasn't very interesting. It was also an enjoyable film, but there was lots of like damage done because they never get the build. Like it's a film that feels like it needs another draft or two, and then gets into production. Because the story didn't actually start until about 40 minutes in. The actual story. Because you've got like 40 minutes of action where Schwarzenegger's a spy who's trying to track down these terrorists. These are like Middle Eastern terrorists. Not someone that's aged well because the terrorists are idiots mostly. And it's the first 40 minutes is him investigating that, and also being a terrible husband to his wife and a terrible father to his daughter, and not paying that much attention because he's so focused on his work. And it leads to some really good action scenes. There's a good scene in the Chateau at the start where he wanders in, does a Bond thing, and then has to shoot his way out, which is fun. It's nothing new in it, but it's enjoyable seeing these ace chases with lots of obvious stunt doubles, but it's still fun, still really enjoyable. Then the actual is that problem where it is his best action scene early in the film, which has the scene where he's following somebody into a bathroom. There's a massive fight in the bathroom. One of the terrorists trying to escape, and it leads to a chase through Washington, like on foot, then on bike with Schwarzenegger on a horse, then up the side of a building, then a bike jumping over to another building. A really terrific scene, really over the top, really enjoyable. There's some obvious stunt doubles here as well, but the craftsmanship there's so much fun that it's something that's not topped in the film. It's almost like you stop here because that's as good as it gets. Is it Cameron at his best when he's taking a situation and inventing? I mean, it's basically a reinterpretation of the scene with Terminator 2 where Schwarzenegger's protecting John Connor, and it starts off in the mall and ends up going into the streets and then going into the viaducts. It's that thing where there's like 3 levels of this chase, and it's a wonderful chase. The Terminator 2 chase is better, but this one's really good too. And then we go into the drama, which means your mind had to switch over because you find out him thinking his wife is having an affair. Turns out she's not, but she's very frustrated and she's on the verge of having one anyway. But she's playing around with the idea because she's so frustrated with him. The problem here is that's much more interesting than the spy thing. But you're seeing it from his point of view, and it's more interesting from her point of view, which is something Cameron would do in Titanic, where we take the problem and somebody doing Terminator, where it was always from Lynn Hamilton's point of view for most of the film. And Aliens, it was going to Weaver's point of view. In this one, it's from Schwarzenegger's point of view, and it's very broy. And so you get the broy stuff, but also the sensitivity stuff, but also the wife stuff as well. But the clash, in a way, you don't have a point of view character, because it starts off with Schwarzenegger, because you've been following him. But Julie Curtis is a much better actor, so you're much more interested in her story. And you're following Schwarzenegger, but he's doing terrible stuff to her out of jealousy, which is really interesting, but it's unbalanced. It's really, the comedy's unbalanced in this sequence, which causes a lot of problems, because you feel creeped out with your lead man, which is a real problem. You can see why he's doing it, you can see why he's gone too far, and it's really interesting to watch Schwarzenegger lose it that much. But because it's Schwarzenegger playing the part, it doesn't work as well because he's not a strong enough actor to really pull it off. But it's still enjoyable, but it's like one of those ones that you really needed. Like, for instance, this would have worked a lot better with Bruce Willis. in the lead. It really would have. Because he's much more human, so it would have made more sense with him. In the flaws in the character, it would have worked better, but with Schwarzenegger it doesn't work as well. But the action works really well. So you get a lot of this for a while, including a notorious scene where he mentally tortures his own wife and he's trying to figure out, rather than having a conversation with her, which the point is, he's so distant from her, he has to go to these real extremes because he doesn't know how to talk to her. But it's unbalanced though, that, again, it needs another draft or two just to work it out. Like, either, basically, she had to be in much more of the first act of the movie in parallel, and then these all things combine. That would have worked better, but the way it is now, it's just two different strands that aren't connecting in a way that really delivers something that works all the way through. Because a lot of Cameron films, you've got different plot lines going on. Like in Terminator 2, you've got the John Connor one, you've got the Sarah Connor one, and the Terminator one, and they all intermingle in different parts. But you always feel there's actually a reason for you watching all this stuff. In this one, I don't feel the reason as much because there's lots of stuff going on, but it's like start-stop all the time. Eventually get together. The plot lines all come together where he's revealed as a spy, she's mad at him, and then you have to escape from the terrorists in a series of outlandish set pieces, which are a lot of fun. I want to say, right, the last half hour of this film is a joy again. It's not quite the same level as the first one, but you have Harrier jump jets, blown up bridges, you get a limo out of control, you have a nuclear meltdown, you've got a bit where Schwarzenegger gets almost blown up, he has to jump into a lake, as the flames go all over him. And there's a great sequence at the end in a Harrier jump jet against a terrorist in a building, he's trying to get his daughter back. All that stuff's great fun. But the problem is the characterizations and kind of still stop-starty. It's like, he has to go off and do this. Then you have to switch back to him as the protagonist after you kind of get fed up with him. You're meant to be behind him, but you're not really behind him. And there's a sequence where they're meant to come together as they blow up some of the terrorists and take out some of a lot of their numbers. But it's just a Rambo sequence where Schwarzenegger shoots lots of people, and this doesn't have the inventiveness of a James Cameron sequence where he tends to get rid of people he wanted rid of in interesting ways. This one, he just kills them all and blows them up, and it's like, that's boring. It's not even well done. So it becomes this thing of the moment you needed to go through the trauma. You can see what he's trying to do, the idea of they have the low point, they have to come together and defeat people, and now they're a couple again. But the sequence he does to do that starts off the worst possible way. It gets better as he has to go and save her. But you're feeling that it would have been interesting if she had to save him at times as well, and it just feels like it's re-establishing everything it's been satirising. I mean, that's why it's a failure compared to Total Recall. Total Recall is always aware of the dynamics of what you're satirising and what you're tweaking and what the stuff the audience expects and how to play with it, how to play the idea of it. Yeah, you're with the people, but we're also manipulating you in funny ways that you know we're manipulating you. And we're pointing out to you at the same time. This one, it all just goes back into the cliches and doesn't quite seem to realise it's going into these cliches where they've been tweaking. And there's that problem with it. It never quite has a balance. It just feels like it was put into production like 6 months too early. Like it was 6 months early when it should have still been through the drafts of the script to get it right. And it's kind of funny because this one seems to be the one, the Cameron stuff that seemed to come out pretty quickly after another film, even though it was only 3 years. It felt like rushed compared to those other films that all felt like they. Because I mean, Terminator 2 came out 2 years after The Abyss, but that doesn't feel rushed compared. But this one does. It just feels like the script wasn't worked out. There's just stuff that doesn't work out, and there's moments where they interact with each other, and there's moments where they're separated, and it's like just the plotting just feels a bit weird. And it's all about him getting his family back together, but his family are kind of ciphers. His daughter's kind of a cipher compared to what, if you look at what Newt was like or John Connor was in Terminator 2, this character's a cipher. And it just becomes a weird thing that hasn't been developed fully, it hasn't been fine-tuned, and which is a shame because Jamie Lee Curtis is the best thing in it. She's gets the one that's abused most. Because she gets good moments and then she gets moments where she's a damsel in distress. And it's funny in some ways, but you feel like there was more to do. Like she should have been involved in that last action scene. And she wasn't. It felt like really weird. So that's True Lies, an interesting mess, but it's still very enjoyable. It's still worth seeing, even though you'll cringe at certain things. You go, oh, not aged well. But it's still fun, but it is very lumbering. It's a very great example of a lumbering mess. It's an 80s film done in the 90s, with 90s production budgets, but it's still an 80s film. And obviously Cameron moved on to PG-13 with Titanic and Avatar and all that other stuff. And Schwarzenegger kind of regressed after this. So this was at the end of an era, and then they moved on to something else. So I hope you enjoyed this video. My look at Arnie in the 90s. It was fun to do, and I'll be back soon with some more.